So we were up at the cemetery earlier today, Lebanon Cemetery in North York. So about a year ago, Tina, of course, volunteers with us, Tina Charles, and she found this book online about Bertie County, which is where I knew our family was from, with the Smallwood outlaw in Hawkins. So when I received the book, I reached out to Dr. Smallwood just on a whim, and we've been speaking, since that time. So about a year sharing information, things on that line. So he came to York this weekend to be able to see the area, see and meet some of the family, and has offered to go over some of the history from Bertie County so that we know more about where we came from. All right? So I will go ahead and turn over to you if you want to do an introduction of yourself, sir. This is your order here.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Samantha. And again, Samantha's been an excellent host in terms of showing me around York and helping me to become acclimated, and had a very good visit here. And it's really wonderful to have met all of you all, and I'll say family members, that are here and have roots here in York, Pennsylvania. I'm Arwin Smallwood. I am the chair of the Department of History and Political Science at North Carolina A&T State University. And just as a way of brief history, born and raised in Indian Woods, Bertie County. All my people, my mother's people, were Cherries and Waltons. My father's people were Smallwoods and Rascals. But both families are from Indian Woods for hundreds of years. They go back hundreds of years. And we'll talk about it in the presentation. But Indian Woods, what is distinguished for and known for is that it was an Indian reservation for the Tuscarora Indians that was given to them in 1717 after the Great Tuscarora War in North Carolina. And we'll talk about that in their relationship actually to old Pennsylvania, historic Pennsylvania, and to the Six Nations or five nations, Iroquois Confederacy that resided in New York State and in this region. So there's an ancient history, an ancient connection between Indian Woods and the old people of Indian Woods, the ancient people of Indian Woods, and then the modern people who migrated here, who may not have even known that history and known that story, but there are two connections, and I'm going to talk a little bit about old Bertie County and old Indian Woods and the connections between those families in this presentation. Again, been teaching for over 30 years. First teaching position was at Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois. I was director of African American Studies there for about 7 years. Left there to go to the University of Memphis, where I built a PhD program in African American history for about 10 years, and then was recruited back to North Carolina, back home to North Carolina A&T, where, like I said before, I run the history and political science department. So that's the gist of me and my family, and again, those lines that are most directly connected to my family. But if you go further back in time, there are even more families, of course, because all of those families, they're freedmen's and outlaws, all the people we've been talking about. They've been in that community for hundreds of years, and they've intermarried more than once, because as they used to say, they married people that they could walk and see. So, people were close together. And so, yeah, there were situations where cousins got married. And when I was going to school, my mom was always, anybody I brought home, she would say, that's your cousin. And I said, well, I just thought she didn't want me to, to date the girls that I brought home, but they were cousins. They were cousins. And I'll say this last quick story, and then I'll get into the presentation. So I was doing the history of the county, and I wrote my dissertation on Indian Woods, my master's thesis on Indian Woods, and then my book, Bertie County, comes out of that research. And I was looking at Rosenwald schools. These were schools that were built with money from Julius Rosenwald, who was in Chicago. He gave money to all the South, blacks in the South to build schools if you matched the money. There were more Rosenwald schools built in Bertie County than anywhere else in the South, or in North Carolina, in anywhere else in the South, and in Bertie County throughout the state of North Carolina. So great interest in education and educating African Americans. But there were 3 older women who were Wessons and Sessoms, who were in their 90s, who had purchased the old Parker Rosenwald School and were living in the school. And I went to interview them to talk about why they bought the school, why they decided to make it a home, and just their history. And in that conversation, they said they grew up over the branch. Now that's on the north side of where I grew up, so I didn't make the connection. And I said, yeah, and they talked about the farming, and we did farm work, and we used to go to church in Spring Hill. And I said, Spring Hill? Why do y'all go to Spring Hill? You way over here on this side. She said, we had a path through the woods. We went to the church. We right through the woods there. And they said, well, we used to farm. I said, okay. And she said, and all we did, we used to ride on Uncle Jake's wagon to go to the farm. I said, Uncle Jake? And you went to Spring Hill? I said, Jake who? He said, Jake Walton. I said, good Lord, boy, we can. I said, that's my great-great-grandfather. My great-grandfather. She said, well, good Lord, boy, we can. And I had gone to school with their grandchildren, and we'd gone to college together as undergrads, and we never knew we were related. And there were Bagemores and Spivens and others that would come out of that line, and they called me and they said, my grandma said we can. And so what my mother was saying was true, that because this was a different part of Bertie County, but all the families were related. So as you get up into Orlando and get up into Hertford County and Hosty, all the families in the county basically were related because we've been there for hundreds of years. It's the oldest county in North Carolina, part of the old Albemarle County, the first county in North Carolina. So all of that as a precursor to this. And Samantha, you'll have to stop me when I run out of time because I am a talker. So there's a lot to talk about since most of the folks here are unfamiliar with the Bertie County part of this. So I'm going to try to go through and talk about some of that. So I titled my presentation Bertie County, North Carolina, or from Bertie County, North Carolina to York, PA. And I also added, a history of the migration of the triracial families of Indian Woods, because from talking to Samantha, quite a few Smallwoods in Indian Woods, and there are quite a few families that are connected, specifically Indian Woods, but then more generally to Bertie County and Windsor. Right? And now we're going to explain how the families are even connected outside of the different counties. So that's why I titled this presentation that. And with the first illustration, and I always insert lots of images, so I'll describe what's happening in the images. This is a family from Indian Woods that was part of the Great Migration, and there were black families that left Bertie County and Indian Woods in North Carolina and the South in general, and they migrated all along the route, along the train route and the bus route. So they ended up in Baltimore, in Philadelphia, in New York, and DC, even as far north as Boston. And so, and Samantha pointed out to me how when you look at this route that I've drawn, how it goes basically right through York. So you have families who were leaving the segregated South and leaving the racism of the segregated South, who were trying to have a better life for their families and for themselves other than share property and tenant farm. And there were some blacks who owned land, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, but there were blacks that did own land and had their own farms, but many families did share property and tenant farm. My mother's people, they were landowners, going back to the Civil War. My father's people, they all share properties and tenant farms. So, you have families that are on both sides, and then families, when they intermarry, the thing that was most concerning to people is that, are you going to take care of my daughter, or are you going to take care of my son? It had less to do with skin color, or less to do with anything else. It was just, are you the kind of person that's going to be a good person to my child? And if you're going to be good to my child and take care of my child, then, it's okay for you to get married. And so we see in this sense, very tight-knit families in Indian Woods, in Bertie County, and then those families, when they migrate to these other places, they remain strong family units. And once one family moves to a particular area, usually they'll bring their siblings up, their brothers, their sisters, their cousins, other folks come up, and they create a community. And they settle in that community, and they look after each other. So this is an example of one of those families in some of the places from North Carolina that they left. Now, when we talk about triracials, I am literally talking about Native Americans, African Americans, and whites. And most people, if you're from North Carolina, I was talking with a group earlier, and I mentioned that in North Carolina, there are more Native people in North Carolina than any place else east of the Mississippi River. There are over 60,000 what we call Lumbees, and many of the Lumbees are Tuscarora mixed, they're mixed people. And then you have Maharans, you have Nottaways, you have Choanoks, and you have Saponis, and you have a whole host of other people who consider themselves African American, but they are mixed. They're part Native and part Black. And you have whole groups of people who consider themselves white, who are part Black and part Indian as well. They're triracial. And so when we talk about that, and we talk about creolization, what we're saying, and I use this illustration to kind of show that, is that it's the merging of cultures. People know about mulattoes, black and white. People know about mestizos, who are Indian and white. Black Indians, both black and Indian. And then there's that group in the center that are all three. They're triracials and they're triracial isolates. And again, I've talked to some of the families, and I think I've heard that from here. Pretty much these families are scattered all over the eastern United States from Indian Woods. But we have a lot of people who have green eyes, blue eyes, gray eyes, sometimes red, sandy red hair. They can be fair skinned or dark skinned. They're all different mixes. And so this is the characteristics of many of these families. I don't know that they're Freemans here, but Freemans, Rascals, the Smallwoods, Outlaws, many of these different families have these different characteristics. So it all depends on who intermarried with whom, but they carry these characteristics, and they've been carrying them for hundreds of years. And they still, you'll have, no matter where they settle, you'll find people with those characteristics, even amongst the native nations. So the Tuscaroras who ended up in New York and ended up in Canada, they still have Mitchells and Freemans, and they still have Hills and Jones and some of the same families. And then they still have in their nations people who have green eyes, blue eyes, and gray eyes. And that's significant because Europeans carry those characteristics. Africans did not; they had brown eyes, and Indians did not. Indians had brown eyes. So whenever you see people with these hazel eyes and different colored eyes, you know that they're mixed. They're triracial to biracial because of those characteristics. So we call it creolization. In other words, it's not just African; it's African and Indian and white, and not only in terms of the blood mixture, but also in terms of the food ways, the cultural practices. Most Africans are not Christians. Indians are not Christians. They became Christians from their interaction with Europeans. The way that many people cook in the South, and there have always been great cooks. Tuscaroras are great cooks too. They had seasoning, and in first contact, many of the Indian people had sugar and sugar cane, and they also had salt and salt flats. So their food always had a nice sweet and salty, taste to it. And the cooking, they carry that with them. That's a tradition. You want what your mother made for you. Your mother, makes that because her mother made that. But these cooking traditions are passed on from generation to generation. And that's one of the ways you really can see cultural practices, remain in existence for many, many hundreds of years. And I can say I'm an example of it myself. When I moved away to the Midwest, I missed my mother's cooking. And so I called my mother and said, well, how did you make that? So she explained how she made her collard greens. She explained how to make barbecue or pork roast, all the foods that she made, beef vegetable soup, all the stuff that she knew how to make. We were talking about corn pudding the other day, but all these things, crackling bread, I don't know if y'all know about that or not either, but all these things, she taught me how to cook them and told me how to cook them because I wanted to eat them. And I was out in the Midwest and I thought the food didn't have a lot of seasoning, and I wanted, what my mother made for me. And in that way, we pass on these traditions from generation to generation. Okay, so just kind of like intersecting, helping to understand creolization and the intersection of race amongst these people. But specifically, Bertie County and Indian Woods. I'm going to give you a little introduction using maps to kind of talk about the county, because I know many of the folks here in York who will be watching this presentation, and those who are here in the room, are not necessarily that familiar with Bertie County and don't necessarily understand, the importance of that long history in Bertie County and that native African-European connection. So I'm going to touch on a little bit of that. And as I said before, Samantha, you stop me when I'm running out of my time so I can take questions, from people if those here have questions. So if you look at and talk about Bertie County, this is a map of North Carolina. And you see Bertie County shaded in gray. North Carolina has 100 counties, and it's broken up into 4 different regions. We have the Tidewater region, the coastal plains, the Piedmont, and the mountains. And Bertie County sits in the coastal plains. And again, it's one of the oldest counties in North Carolina. It was a part of the original Albemarle County, which was the first county created in North Carolina, and they included all of those northeast counties. What became Hereford, Gates, Halifax, Pasquotank, Clemens, Camden, all of those early counties made up Albemarle County. And then Bertie was split from it, and then Hereford County, Halifax, Northampton, Gates, Martin County were all split from Bertie. So all of those families and all of those regions, that pretty much that whole corridor there, what we call the coastal plains, they are really related by blood. Because when I talk about Robeson County, which is down in the southeast on the border with South Carolina, you have the Lumbees down in that area. Many of the Lumbees, prominent families amongst the Lumbees, the Berries, the Locklears, the Lowrys, they all came out of Indian Woods. And they migrated down to that part of the state hundreds of years ago. In the 1700s, they migrated down into Robeson County. And so it's just important. This is the geography of North Carolina, and this is where Bertie County is located. Within Bertie County, you have basically 9 townships, and Indian Woods is still one of those townships. So when they break the county up into county commissioners and elections and the politics of the county, there are 9 separate townships. Indian Woods, which was an Indian reservation, and people there were cohesive, and over 90-some%, 99, 95% African American, or what I call mixed race. It's a very, even today, a very close-knit community of people. Much smaller, many people moved away, older people are dying out, but still a very close-knit community. And so Indian Woods was created as its own separate, political district. And so, and even today, that's still the case. But it is a state historic site, as I said before. It was established in 1717 by the colony of North Carolina to be given to the Tuscarora Indians at the end of the Tuscarora War. And it was really the first reservation established in North America. That's one of the significance, first point, the significance of the history of Indian Woods. It was one of the first established reservations in the history of what became the United States. It's the earliest. And many of these people, like I said again, were of mixed heritage. This is a historic map of Bertie County. If you look at it, you'll see that it's Bertie County. It sits on the Roanoke River, and it shows the boundaries of the reservation, which was in the southern part of Indian Woods, and it shows the Tuscarora town. It was an active Tuscarora town there from 1717 throughout until 1801. And in 1801, there was a major uprising, a planned slave rebellion between the Africans that were there and the Tuscaroras that were there. And it was the worst planned slave insurrection in the history of the state of North Carolina. It was not successful, and afterwards, the state of North Carolina made the rest of these Tuscaroras leave North Carolina, and they went north to New York and settled with their kin at Niagara Falls in New York State at the Tuscarora Reservation, and then others moved over into Canada, and they settled at Grand River, which is Six Nations Reserve, Grand River outside of Brant, Canada, which is south of Toronto. Again, another major historical fact about the community. The Tuscaroras accused of harboring runaway slaves who fled into the reservation. They were accused of marrying and intermixing with the runaway slaves, and when those Tuscaroras who had participated in the rebellion were forced to leave, they looked more African than they did Indian. Some were very dark, some had green eyes, blue eyes, gray eyes. They could be dark with straight Indian hair, and with blue eyes or green eyes, they were of all different shades of color. But they spoke the language and had maintained the religious and political practices of the Tuscaroras so well that when they came up to Canada, to Grand River, they were made a part of the governing council of the Six Nations, and they were able to join the council. So it's important to understand whatever your concept or construct of what an Indian is and what they're supposed to look like and how they is cultural. At the end of the day, it's cultural. And these people had passed on to their children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, an identity that was rooted in Haudenosaunee culture or Iroquois culture, and that still was part of who they were, including their cooking practices and so forth, for many, many generations. We got a chance to look at the cemeteries today. And so I put in this slide, and it's also in the Bertie County Book of Indian Woods Baptist Church. Many Smallwoods at Indian Woods Baptist Church. My father is buried there, Bart Smallwood. My grandfather is buried there, S.T. Smallwood. A lot of Smallwoods buried at Indian Woods Baptist Church. A lot of Smallwoods were part of that church. So that cemetery is full of many of the families that you have here in York. It's full of them. And it's there on the grounds of the church, and it's an old cemetery. The church dates back. We know it's on old Civil War maps as early as 1863, but it dates back to being one of the oldest churches in Bertie County. And the Tuscaroras who left Indian Woods in 1803 to go to join their kinsmen in New York and in Canada, they were missionary Baptists, and it's a missionary Baptist church today. And many of them were Masons, and the Masons were very strong in the community. And the Masons Lodge is right beside the church. It's on the opposite side of the church. You can't see it in this image, but it's on the opposite side of the church. The families that are there, and this is just some of the families that are there, it's not all of the families, but of course outlaws, and so you know that there are outlaws here. You have Cherries and Browns, and of course no Smallwoods, but also the Scrolls and Pews and Wiggins, and some of these names, when we talk about these families and these family names, many of the last Tuscarora chiefs were Pews, Smallwoods. They were some of these same families. And they were dispersed in North Carolina, and some of them settled in southeast North Carolina in places like Columbus County, what we call Indian Wells, which is down in New Brunswick and down near Wilmington in Southport, and also Robeson County. So we talk about Locklears and Chief Locklear, Leon Locklear, his people. But many of these families came out of Indian Woods. Many of these families share the same heritage. I mean, they're mixed race, triracials, share the same heritage. But some of them are considered Lumbees, but basically they're the same people. Almost indistinguishable. You see some people, you look at them, you see African American, but they say they're Lumbee. And you look at others, they acknowledge that they are African American. So you acknowledge your kin. If they can't acknowledge you, you acknowledge them. If they don't acknowledge you, then you don't acknowledge them, right? But people know their kin. So a little bit about Native American past, and I'll touch on that very briefly. In terms of the Tuscarora origins and their roots. And I start with this image when we talk about the Tuscarora of Indian Woods. This is actually a picture that I got when I was in Bradley. When I was at Bradley, I used to speak at the prison, to talk to the inmates during Black History Month. My very first trip out to the prison, there's a federal correctional center in Canton. I was driving along the Illinois River, and along the river I saw a sign. The sign said Tuscarora. I said, oh, that's wild. That's off the chain. Tuscarora. I said, let me go see what this is about. So back then, 20 years ago, I drove up the bluff, because it was in the bluff, up the bluff, and I knocked on the door of the first house I got to. And I said, why? I saw a sign down here that says Tuscarora. I said, do you know what that's about? He said, this is our community. It's called Tuscarora. I said, well, why is it called Tuscarora? He said, because Tuscaroras live here. I said, well, that's not possible. I said, Tuscaroras from North Carolina, moved to New York, Grand River in Canada, and up to Montreal, Kanawage. I said, Tuscaroras. I said, no, it's called Tuscarora because Tuscaroras lived here. I didn't believe them, but I said, thank you. Got back in the car, went to the prison, came back to Peoria, and went to the public library and pulled the records to find out this is not possible, this is true. It was true. There had been a group of Tuscaroras in the 1830s who had moved from New York State to Peoria, Illinois, had intermarried with the Peoria Indians, and then were forcibly moved to Oklahoma, where they settled with the Seneca Cayuga people in the northeast corner of Oklahoma. This is one of their people. And you see the person. I don't know what your concept or construct of an Indian is, but you can tell he's of mixed heritage. Okay? So it's important to understand that when we talk about Indian Woods in Bertie County, when we talk about the reservation, that many of the people that were there who were of Indian ancestry, many of their kin, in that area, they had this complex history, which had been part of their history and background for many, many generations, and they knew who they were. Okay. It's also important to understand, and this map outlines it, that the Tuscaroras were part of what became known as the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy was made up originally of 5 nations. In Pennsylvania, the Quakers of Philadelphia, William Penn, all the treaties, Benjamin Franklin's Book of Treaties from 1737 until 1763 or 67, the Quakers negotiated with the 5 nations, and after 1722, the 6 nations, the Iroquois Confederacy, so all this area out here, they were very much aware of the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, and the Tuscaroras who were their kinsmen in the South. And after the Tuscarora War, the Tuscarora lived in Virginia, and if you look at this map, you will see they're in Virginia, you see the Chesapeake, and if you go on up through Virginia and Maryland, you'll see the Tuscaroras laying with their kinsmen, the Oneidas, who took them in there. And many of the Tuscaroras went up on the Tuscarora Trail, and when I talk about the Tuscarora Trail, it runs right through this area. The Tuscarora Trail is an ancient trail. That's how they say they moved down into North Carolina. They continue to go back and forth on the trail. And the Tuscarora Trail is significant also because it becomes the early Underground Railroad. People want to give credit to the Quakers, which we don't take that credit from them. They want to give credit to others, abolitionists, and even African and African American abolitionists. But Indians
assisted on the Underground Railroad. They initially were smuggling their people out of North Carolina and South Carolina who had been kidnapped and sold into slavery before the Tuscarora War, during the Tuscarora War, and after the Tuscarora War. And they would come back to the South to take revenge against the whites and against the Indians that enslaved them, and they would bring their people back. And they would take them right through this area and on over towards Harrisburg and Lackawanna, I believe it is. And then from there on up the Hudson River Valley, they'd go over and go up, and they would go to Ganawage, which is outside of Montreal, Canada. They would go to through Detroit to Windsor, Canada, Windsor, North Carolina, Windsor, Canada. The Tuscarora Reservation in New York is outside of Lewiston, New York, Lewiston, North Carolina. And so these connections, there is a lot in the name, and there are connections and historic connections. But it's important to understand that the 5 nations, and after 1722, when the Tuscaroras moved up after the war, the 6 nations were the most powerful Indian nations in the history of North America. And they collectively had a confederation that included the Delaware, the Shawnees, all of the different Indians of the Ohio Valley, the Miamis, as well as the Susquehannas and others, the Mattaponi, the Pamunkeys in Virginia. They had a massive Indian confederation that really controlled territory from the Cape Fear River in North Carolina all the way up to the Hudson River in the St. Lawrence River in Canada, and then from the Hudson River in the east all the way over to the Mississippi River in the Ohio Valley. And again, a massive empire. And the reason for that, as this illustration shows, is because that's where they originated. You know, the oldest history, you know, predates Europeans, you know, thousands of years ago. They say they came from the Ohio Valley. And if you know about this great ancient city of Cahokia, which is a native city outside of St. Louis, Missouri, and the mounds are still there. You can go to Cahokia today. That was their ancient city. That was, you know, thousands of years ago. They were in Cahokia. There was a great natural disaster. You know, we've seen floods in New Orleans and how it displaced millions of people, and we see how natural disasters are impacting us even today as a society. There was a great flood in the Mississippi River Valley, and their homes were flooded, and they had to leave, and they migrated east. So the purple area you see is the homeland, became the homeland of the Haudenosaunee, because when they left as one group. And I was at the presentation, I keep asking about these weeping willows. There were some questions at the conference we attended earlier today about weeping willows. Well, when the Iroquois, before they left Cahokia and went east, they said they were one people. They were not different families, different branches, they were just one. And at that time, you know, the weeping willow, which they called the rain tree, had great spiritual significance to all of the people. So wherever the Haudenosaunee go, you know, and their nation was called Haudenosaunee, and then they break out into what we call the 6 nations, along with the Nottaways and Maharans down in North Carolina. They're one people, but wherever they go, they planted weeping willows, rain tree, weeping willows wherever they went. And it was it signified the time when they were one people, before they split into the 6 nations, and really, if you count the Nottaways and Maharans, that's 8 different nations of Indians. And I point that out because we've been talking about how big the Smallwood families have been. You have 12, 13, 14, 15 kids, and I talked about the fact that I have one uncle that had roughly 18 kids and one around 21 kids. It doesn't take one generation, because of such big families, for people to be completely separated. And I tell these little stories to kind of make this real. I worked in Peoria and worked at Bradley for 7 years. In that time, I had one person come to the school from Chicago who was a Smallwood. And she looked like she could be some of my people. We talked, said, well, you got any people in Chicago? I said, no, we don't have any people in Chicago. I said, where are your people from? She said, well, Chicago. I said, no, I said, where are your mother from? Chicago. I said, where your grandmother from? Chicago. I said, ask your people where they're from, where your people from, because they're not from Chicago. They came from somewhere else, and they moved to Chicago. And so she never got back to me. And the next semester, my mother calls me, and she says, your uncles are going to Chicago. I said, why? She said, because your great uncle died, and they're going to the funeral. I said, we got people in Chicago? She's got a whole bunch of people in Chicago. He had a whole mess of kids, a whole bunch of kids up there in Chicago. There's a whole bunch of them up there. A lot of Smallwoods up in Chicago. And then later, I met Jesse Jackson, who is a A&T alum, And he said, yeah, we know Smallwoods. Smallwoods helped me with the movement. You know, they helped me. You know, yeah, they're very active. You know, very good Smallwoods. I know Smallwoods very well. So branches of family everywhere. You know, because they're so huge. You know, and they just kept migrating to different places. And it only takes one generation to completely lose touch with your people if you don't keep up with your people. So it's important to get together with the people and know who they are. So I'm saying that to go back to this ancient, you know, connection. The Iroquois, even after they left Cahokia and moved east and became the Haudenosaunee and split into the 6 nations, they maintained their political, cultural ties with one another, their familial ties with one another, which is why after the Tuscarora War, they took their kinsmen in. The Tuscaroras came back up to New York as refugees from their homeland in North Carolina, and the Iroquois embraced them and brought them in and made them the 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. And as you see, not just New York State, but it comes down eventually into Pennsylvania, that is a significant part of their territory.
So I'm going to hold there just for a moment. So one, I was showing on Facebook Live, we did have some technical difficulties. However, we have been reporting on other media so that we have the tape and it's also not shaky from my hands. So we will put that out via a YouTube link, and we'll have that for everyone so they'll have that clear video. So what I'm going to do, one, I do want to remind people, anyone that is interested in the book, we are here at Market View Arts on West Philadelphia Street. You can come on in now. You must wear your mask. We'll be here till 8 o'clock. And I'm going to allow folks to ask questions. I'm going to cut this feed, but we will be recording and the full video will be up later tonight. Thank you. Jim, you are over there writing frantically with some notes. Any feedback thus far as what you know with this area? I know I was telling Dr. Smallwood that we also have a Windsor, York County, because he kept on talking about Windsor. And you know, just the significance of that name.
I had a question in reference to, you mentioned the fact that a lot of the integration between the Indians and, let's say, the Africans, Americans. And I wonder, a lot of times when we take the DNA test, it says you're this, you're this, you're this, you're that, but you're not Indian. Why is that?
Well, I always have to say there are no absolutes in history, right? So I'll start with that, because I don't know, what the results, and I don't know which company you use. But oftentimes people, when they do the DNA test, what it will say is that they have a small part Asian. A lot of times it'll come up as Asian. And Native Americans originally came from Asia. Realize that. So if people don't necessarily know that might not be something they connect with. But they come from Asia and they cross over, of course, thousands of years ago, and they cross down into, and even the Tuscaroras, a lot of material in Tuscaroras is held at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. I was a fellow there and went through their records. They have recorded stories, transcribed stories from 1918 and also from the 1930s about these stories. And they have a land bridge story that the Tuscaroras have passed down from generation to generation to generation. That they came across the ice, that they came across the ice from Asia and came into the Americas and then settled. So this is ancient history before Cahokia that they kept these stories and brought them back. But so oftentimes, you have to know what you're looking for. And if you see an Asian marker, it's going to be a small marker. And the reason why it's a small marker is because, again, when we start talking about this African and Indian mixing, this is happening in the 1500s, late 1500s in North Carolina, 1580s, the 1600s and 1700s. You see what I'm saying? And then you're going to start, when we talk about enslavement, and some of the first slaves were Indians. Now, that's the other thing to remember. The Tuscarora War was about Indian slavery, right? And after the end of the war, you had a third of the nation that was slaughtered in the war. And then you have a third of the nation that were enslaved. And even before the war, they were being shipped as slaves to the British Caribbean, so they ended up in all of the islands in Jamaica, St. Kitts, Nevis, Barbados, and then they're going to be enslaved in Virginia and North Carolina as well. And then you layer on top of them Africans, the Gullah Geechee people down in South Carolina. Barnwell, was one of the generals colonel who fought in the war against the Tuscaroras. And when he left, he took hundreds of Tuscaroras as slaves back to South Carolina and took them out to the to the islands in South Carolina. And then they layer Africans on top of them. So people who really know Gullah Geechee history, know the Gullah Geechee, they know that the foundation of Tuscarora slaves, that then Africans layered on top of them. And one of the reasons why the African is so dominant is because the Africans came most recently and brought their African traditions and culture, and they get layered on top of the Indian culture. But if you talk about like Bertie County and Indian Woods and in North Carolina, the foods that people eat, how they prepare their food, the different traditions, most traditions of folks in North Carolina are Indian in nature. Even if you, I don't know if you all know about this or heard about this, but back in Indian Woods, you have people talk about root workers, the roots, putting roots in paints and spirits and witches and stuff. All of that is Iroquois. All of that, shapeshifters and shape-shifting, all of that is Iroquois. It's shamanism, right? And folks who didn't understand it, and then they see the blacks and Indian together, and they're saying they're colored and Negro, they're black. They don't see it as being Indian. They see it as African, but it wasn't African. It was Indian, you know. And they did it in New York. They did it in Canada, you know. Because they're shaman. That's part of their culture.
Yeah, but that answers my question, because in our family, a lot of people say that, you know, they have they're part Indian,
Mm-hmm.
but when they take the DNA, no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And keep in mind, and keep in mind too, as I mentioned before, about it's more cultural than it is blood. Unlike Cherokees who believe in the blood quantum, Iroquois never believed in blood quantum. The way Iroquois based the Tuscaroras in particular, and they still do that in New York, is it's based on their women. In other words, you are a Tuscarora because your mother was a Tuscarora, your grandmother was a Tuscarora, your great-grandmother was a Tuscarora, your great-great-grandmother. And that way they said they had preserved the female bloodline going all the way back from their origins, from their beginnings. They, you know, are Tuscarora because of their women, their clan mothers. And the women, you know, the clan mothers, basically, they decide who the chiefs will be, and they make the decisions for the government. Now, in Indian Woods, I don't know if that's true here or not, but in Indian Woods, the women have an extraordinary amount of power. And the church, you know, you saw the picture of Indian Woods Church, Spring Hill Church will be the same. The churches tended to operate like longhouses, right? The men used to sit on one side of the church, the women sat on the other side of the church, and the children always joined the church of their mother, right? It's cultural practice, right? And the women decide who the pastor is and whether the pastor stays. If the women don't want them there, they got to go. Now that might change down here, might not be the same up here, but down home, the women have an extraordinary amount of power and influence over the community, which is the case for Iroquois people and Iroquois culture, right? So we have these things that do. I asked my mother once, I said, well, why do we do that? She said, because Moore did it. Moore was her mother. I said, well, why did Moore do it? She said, because Moore did it. That was her grandmother. I said, why did Momo do it? Because Momo did it, and that's the way we're going to do it. That's the way it's always been done, and that's the way it's going to be done. In the story. Don't ask me no more questions. And so in this way, people pass on these traditions from generation to generation through the females, through the women, you know, and through the men. These traditions are passed on, and people just do them. It just becomes part of who we are, right? And then people assume it's all black, it's all African, when it's not. But again, to your point about the DNA, the Tuscaroras they're not in the DNA database, and they don't let their DNA be used in that way. But if you go to like 21andMe and those people who have been doing, 21andMe, I think it's 23andMe or 23andMe, you will find hits between families, Lumbee families, you know, hits with families in New York, you know, close blood kin, you know, people being hit. I mean, I've been reached out to by different families from Virginia and from other places, because I haven't done the DNA test myself, but they matched with people in Bertie County. They matched with different families. And as you pointed out about the DNA test, sometimes, and this is for whites as well, Europeans or whites who consider themselves European, when they do their DNA test, they have more African DNA than they do European DNA. And many Africans, no matter how dark they are, when they do their DNA, they have more European than they do, you know, African. And then they don't, the markers, again, for the native is going to be the Asian. And you got to look back and you got to look at Asian, and it's, you know, different groups from Asia, that you will connect with the Mongolian people, that you'll connect this to. I don't want to spend too much time on that point, but it's a good point. when my children were born, I have twins, a boy and a girl. When they were born, there's called a Mongolian mark. It's on the back of the child, just above the buttocks, right? And it's called a Mongolian mark. It's this brown spot. It's on the back of the child. All people who are descended from these Mongoloid people coming out of Asia who are connected to Native Americans have that birthmark. And both my children had it when they were born. I saw it for myself. Okay? It goes away eventually, but it's there. You see it if you know what you're looking for. So just a footnote to this discussion that we are complex and we are mixed and like I said again, but if you don't acknowledge that and you're looking simply at skin color and simply at what a person looks like, because they're coming from the same family, one person could be dark, the other person light. You know what I'm saying? The same family. That's just genetics. That's just the nature of genetics. It just you don't know how it's going to turn out. So yes.
Great Migration happened loosely between 1915 and 1970. And in York County, it kind of peaked in 1931. And much of the migration took place from South Carolina, Pembroke County. I'm sure you've heard that, know that. Where did the North Carolina migration when did that tend to occur? During that same period?
Right, yes, it's the same period. Yeah, we call it the Great Black Migration. And basically what happens is, because of Jim Crow and segregation in the South, many African Americans are going to migrate to Midwestern and Northeastern cities for better economic and educational opportunities, to move out, get away from the South. Primarily in the South for sharecropping and tenant farming. There are some blacks, as I mentioned before, who did own their own land, but the majority were sharecroppers and tenant farmers. And just to outline that sharecropping and tenant farming, what you have is that whites who control the land, and you were working for them on the land, they could pay you what they wanted to pay you. And so even though you're working and you're harvesting the crop, what they would offer, you had to get your seed, your fertilizer, you had to get your shoes, your boots, your clothes, your jeans from them, and they would mark the prices up. So they would charge you astronomically for the supplies that you needed to just get to work, start to work the mules, seed, everything. And then when you harvested your crops, they basically set the crops very low. And so you lost money. You lost money in the growing season when you went to get your stuff. You lost money when you tried to sell your stuff. And so within the first year of sharecropping and tenant farming, most blacks were dead. So they're in economic slavery. They just left slavery. Slavery ended in 1865. Now the year after that, or 2 years after that, they were in economic slavery, but they owe everything, owe money to the master. And then they're charging outrageous interest rates. The interest rates are not normal. So within the first year of compounded interest, they have to keep working the land and they're working for nothing. And so the children, they want to get off and they leave.
If I can, just because we have two of my uncles that are here that were born in Bertie County. So correct me if I'm wrong, I believe Serena and Willie, your grandparents, got here probably late 1930s, and then the Hawkins line got here around 1942. My mother was born here in Pennsylvania, York, Pennsylvania, 45? 45. So she was the second child born here, I believe. So is that correct? So the Smallwoods were here about 38, 39?
Yes. Yeah, they, my grandfather, his brother was here first. They came, how he got to Bamberg, South Carolina, I don't know. A lot of the information, when we were coming up and grown people were talking, when you came around, they quiet. They didn't tell you nothing.
Right.
They didn't tell you nothing. And I think one of the reasons for that was the fact that most people in those years, they would have to work far from home. So they'd have to find someplace else to live. So if they found someplace to live, they would have another family.
Yeah.
And, when they came back home, they had that family. So that's how a lot of people are in the same family, but they didn't know.
Right.
Because we were never told.
Right.
But the grown people knew, and they would talk about it. When the church knew, they knew. they would talk about, but, you know, they, so when people ask you about your family, you know, you really can't tell who's who because you were not allowed to be around, listen to grown folks.
Right.
Yeah, one of the things that, I was born in Bertie County also.
Can you
Brother
introduce
Dixon.
yourself?
Oh, my name is Joe Hawkins. But I grew up mostly in New York. What happened, when I turned 18, I said, I have to get out of here because where we lived and how we lived, and we'd go back and forth to see our grandparents and relatives. My mother, Pauline, was the oldest of the Willie Smallwood. And she was educated, and she told us, be nice to people. She always worked for white people. My dad didn't want to be a farmer. He said, farming is not for me. I'm not going to do it. So he worked at the lumber place, he worked at the shipyards. Anywhere he could get a job, he always worked. But that's very, very difficult. One of the things that I wanted to do was say, I'm not going to be a farmer, period. And I'm not going to listen to a lot of things that people tell me because I read everything. My mother was a great reader, read everything she could get her hands on, and she passed it on to us. We read every book you could think of about every subject. Every one of us picked a specialty of one kind we enjoy. Like one of my brothers says, oh, I like science fiction. The other one said, I like horror stories. I wanted to see some of everything because I wanted to know. I'm inquisitive. If you tell me something, I want to know if it's true or not. I'm going to look it up. So I have a library card, I'm checking. When I joined the military, I went everywhere in the world. You can name, I've been there. So I've met people from all over. But I've met people with different opinions in every country. People take advantage of each other, try to say, I'm smarter than you, I'm better than you, and this, that, and you're somebody else. I'm always going to be me. What I always say is, when I look in the mirror, I see me. That's the person I must like. Everyone else, I can fit in. And I'm not going to do anything to hurt you, but I'm going to let you know that I like me. And if you don't, that's your problem. And I will tell you that. It gets me in trouble in different places because Hawaiians didn't like me. Ethiopians didn't like me. You know, I had a great time in France because I'm married to a French woman also, but that's different. But one thing that happened, I'd go to these places and some people would say, we don't like American colored folks. And I go, do you know any? And they said, well, aren't you? I said, no, I'm Joe. You don't know me. And if you do, sooner or later you're going to find out that you're going to have to like me as a person, or you're going to have an issue. Because I'm going to tell you, you can't disrespect me. I'm nice to you, and I don't mind. But I will tell you, don't play with me. I'd rather just talk to you and leave you alone. But if you confront me, I'm going to let you know I'm not somebody to play with. It works, and it doesn't work. First time I went down south to live or work in the military, my brother who was in the military didn't tell me it was segregated. I went on the base and I went to the service club to shoot pool, and the people said, what are you doing here? I said, I'm going to shoot pool. And they said, in the wrong club. Wrong club, I'm in the Army. The Army is integrated, they're not here. I'm like, oh. Anyway, to make a long story short, I lasted about 5 weeks in that state of Virginia, and they said, we got something for you. And what is that? I met a general officer, company commander, my first sergeant, all of them. All these people show up with the lieutenant governor, and they say, you're a nice guy and you're pretty smart, but we're going to have to do something about you and your attitude. We're going to send you to Europe, where you'll fare better and stay out of trouble. But they put in the record that they put me out of that state for 10 years.
Wow.
Don't come back to this state.
Wow.
So I'm on a ship going to Europe, and I meet some other people, and they say, what's going on? And you finished school? And yeah, they gave a high certificate. Oh, you graduated from school? I said, 8 weeks school, and you graduated in 5 weeks? Yeah. He said, why? School is basically nothing. I'm not dumb. But I also had to leave the state. They said, what? I showed them my record. I look in there and said, well, you can't go to another place with this in your record. We got to get rid of this. And they tore it up, and I So the young white guy did that. You can't go there like that. Okay. So
How
I get
long-
over there.
How long were you in the military?
I was in the military a total of 26 years. And then I went to work for the U.S. government. Military was good for me, believe it or not. Because what happens is people get promoted based on their ability to influence and lead and whatever in all that case. And since I was pretty smart, the commanders have to get graded on how many people attend school, pass school, do this, that, and the other. You go to school. Why? Because you're going to pass the course. And I get credit for having people in school and getting educated right away. I also was qualified to go to officer school. You the man I need. I can type because I have business in school. They said, oh, you're good at reading, you can write, you can go to cut, and you can type too. I said, yeah. Well, you're not going to do your job, which is important. You're going to work in the office. I'm going to work in the office. Yeah, I'm going to type the reports. I'm going to write the reports. I wrote court martials. I wrote this, that, and the other. Anything that needed to be done for the commander, I did. But I also had to go to school. One of the things you learn about people is everybody has their own opinions and their own feelings and their own thoughts and everything else. If you take on their problems, it will cause you a problem. If you like you and you think about you and you do the research and you read and study, you don't need the problem. You can deal with it or not deal with it. Don't take them home with you because it's not yours. You got to live with you, and then you can have other people come in. So it worked well for me. So the government gave me an education. They gave me good jobs. Went through school, and nobody said, why don't you apply for officer school? I said, okay, I can do that too, but I got sick. Wound up in the hospital and said, oh, they don't want me to do that. Then they offered me a commission, but I had to go to Vietnam, and I had to go as a young lieutenant in the infantry. I'm like, I've already been there in the advisory group, and I worked with the helping people and all that, but I went there early. Stayed 6 months, and they said, you got to stay because of tour duties here. Oh, hell no. They're shooting at people. That's what I meant. I'm not doing that. So I left. A year later, they sent me back again to clear up some mess for another 6 months. And I go, this is not good, but I had to clear up the stuff that had been going wrong. So I leave and I come back, and they said, well, you didn't do your tour of duty. You didn't want to take this commission. What are you going to do with yourself? I said, I'm not doing that. I've been lucky once. Now I've been lucky twice. I don't have to go. I'm not going. I said, okay, fine. But what the whole point is, my mother said, you can do what you want to do as long as you want to. Then when I had gone down south, and I meet some of the family members, in our Smallwood family, Outlaw family, and all that. And I see one of my cousins, and this lady is red hair, blue eyes. Like, what the hell?
That's awesome.
I'm like, oh, I thought it.
That's awesome.
And then I said, oh, we go someplace, and I see people.
That was assistant, not son.
Yeah. Well, there were lots of them from all over, and they are all different colors.
No, there was only 2 throwbacks.
So I.
Well, there were 2. They were my.
There was 2 throwbacks.
Hold on, one moment, please. I apologize. So I know that Jim and his beautiful wife need to head out, but one thing that I did want to say is that, with Dr. Smallwood, we have talked about maybe setting up a Zoom meeting that we
Right.
can have some dialogue, some things going on. He was telling me you had, over, was it 400 USCT out of Bertie County alone? The colored troops, and I know, Jim, you cover a lot with Civil War and working with Scott. But for the family, wanting these discussions to continue, so Jim, my Uncle Joe, has moved back to York, so he is here. I'm just saying, in case,
I ain't never
in
come
case
back.
we want to.
I'm back in the box. That's the only way I come back in the box.
We did want to follow up, but,
So I live here in New York, and I do some volunteer work for the agency. I'm going to be doing taxes for the folks. I'm not a tax expert, I just know how. And because of that, I do that volunteer work for 3 to 4 months. And then they say, well, you have to do it for this. No, And I'm not doing that again, but I do it every year. The thing is, the whole point I was making is the race or the Smallwoods and the Outlaws and the Cherries and all of this, some of them I really know. Matter of fact, the Cherry farm down in North Carolina, they said, if you want to come down here and get in your plot, I'm like, what? We got relatives on the farm right
Yeah,
now.
our grandmother-in-law down there.
Grandmother-in-law, they said, come down here, because you
You all buried there.
I said, no, I'm not doing that.
No, I'd like to say one thing. in
They're just
terms
gonna
of-
slide past you real quick and so that they get.
One thing I'd like to say was that when you talked about sharecropping, we moved, my grandfather was originally on the rice farm. My grandfather and grandmother and my mother. And my mother and father, when they got married, they became the overseers on the rice farm. We had 3 mules. We had Sam, Bertie, and Black Ann. All the people, the Meltons, all the people, the Blue Clots, all of them, they all lived in these shacks. They were like 1-room, 2-room shacks with 10 kids, you know. And they all worked on the farm. And we raised peanuts, tobacco, and cotton. In addition to, you know, for our substance, we had gardens and, you know, pigs and chickens and all that kind of stuff. But my father and my mother, no matter, and everybody else who worked on that farm, no matter how hard they ever worked, they never made a dime. They always owed. In fact, when we left there, we left at night. Oh, you know, the money for the crops passed. So my father got this was in 1941. He got a job in Baltimore, Maryland, at Squirrel Shipyard.
Mhm.
And he worked in Squirrel Shipyard there. That was during the war. And then after that, we moved to. We were sort of getting in a little. We lived in a bad neighborhood in East Baltimore back then, 2104 McCullough Street. And my mother decided this was not the place that she wanted us to go up in, and she moved us to York.
Okay, to York.
And that's how we got to York.
Yeah.
And of course, her mother and father were living here at that time also. And so the Rascals and, you know, the Atterburys and, you know, the Smallwoods, all of them, there are a lot of them here. And when you mention the fact that, when you look at the list of names, the Ruffins, all those, yeah, that's your cousin. That's your cousin. That's your cousin. Hey, every place we went, you know, when I go down to North Carolina, you know, in Orlando or in the Hosky, that's your cousin.
Yep.
Mhm.
That's your cousin. And let's not even talk about,
Maryville?
no, next to where those who were passing live at.
When?
Yeah, we may
No,
have,
next
farther
to,
down?
that was,
Oh, I know what you're
you
talking
know,
about.
next to
Right there
the
in
Elks
woods.
home. The Elks,
The Elks is in Winton. That's in Winton.
That's in Winton.
No, that's in Winton, but next to Winton, what's the next to Winton? Whatever that, anyway, every time I'd be driving one of my cousins, the police would stop me. And they said, oh, you from, go on now. But that's the way it was, you know, and so when you talk about, you know, families, you know, the Cherries, the Whites, and all of those stuff, so
Yeah.
I know them all.
Yeah, they were, you know, and what you're describing, you know, your brother's describing his experiences. I would say that collectively, even today, that is still a vein that runs through the families that are remaining. I mean, you know, it's all about, you know, they're gonna take. I was telling Samantha, we just I was going to try to come up sooner, but I didn't make it up because they were dedicating the new community building. And, you know, the community has a volunteer fire department, Indian Woods has a volunteer fire department, and it has a recreation center. And my father started both. We started the fire department and the recreation center. And
can you tell the unique aspect of the fire department today?
in turn, that it's probably one of only 2 at most African American fire departments in the state of North Carolina. You know, all African American fire departments. So it's very unique. And but they have worked, you know, to maintain, you know, that department and the community building.
I've written the book, and I try to, stay connected to families down there and to the community. And, but they got a grant to build this new community building. And it's an impressive building. And I was telling Samantha and talking about the fact that our fathers, these are the young men that are still there. My brother still, I have 2 brothers that still live there. One's raising a family, the other is pretty much a bachelor. And then the other kids that our fathers built the first community building in the fire department, and they all now maintain it. And they built that new community building. The first one was built out of wood, and I always say wood and stones, but built out of wood and concrete. They poured the concrete themselves, and they framed it, and they built it themselves. And this new one was made out of steel, impressive building, $250,000 building. But the skills they possess as electricians, as welders, they to cut costs, they built the structure themselves. So they did what our ancestors did. They built the community building themselves and used the skills that they had, that they were, to wire and weld and put the building together. So we did the grand opening. I believe it was last weekend. We did the grand opening. The point is, and then all the community came together, and again, food for everybody was free, and so all the families that are still, there, but we're all related by blood going back for hundreds of years. But that is the nature of the people. And they stand on their own, they protect their own, they look after each other, and they have an identity. Growing up in that community, it was never a question of who I was and who I was going to be.
Well, that was the same thing when it became New York. Everybody knew everybody. You knew your first cousin, your second cousin, or third cousins. The families would say the Lord, and they bring all the kids together, and the women would make soap, And if you said a bad word, you got to taste it.
You got
to taste it.
So,
my grandmother, they knew how to do anything. And in fact, she was, I don't care, nobody had no money from a doctor. So she would go out and she get some roots, put it in some liquor she made, give it to you, whatever else, it would cure.
But all those cures, again, bring it back around to the native aspect. You gotta remember, when Africans came here, when Europeans came here, they didn't know anything about North America. They didn't know anything about, what crops were poisonous, what crops were, had health, benefits. They learned it from the Native Americans.
Right.
In Indian Woods, there was Dr. Charles Smallwood. That's where a lot of the Smallwoods in Indian Woods come off of. Dr. Charles Smallwood and his brother Robert Smallwood's plantation. And Dr. Smallwood was a medical doctor. And his diaries and his papers are at the UNC Chapel Hill, the Southern Historical Collection. And I've gone through them. And one of the things he was doing, he was writing down remedies for diseases, for ailments that people had. And he also talked about the people in Indian Woods. He talked about Tuscarora courting practices, marital practices. The point is that he was living in there in the 1840s and 1850s, and he was writing down all these things. He was learning them from people like Noah Smallwood, these shamans. They were pretty much African, but they were still practicing roots and practicing stuff to help people in the community. And he was copying down what they, did. And then he was still noting that they still were Tuscaroras or behaving as Tuscaroras because he's writing down their practices. He's writing down their courtship practices, their marital practices, how they did various things. So no matter what they looked like culturally, they were still, carrying on these traditions that were really native in origin. So, but again, if you don't know what Iroquois traditions are, then again you can misconceive, because some of the scholars, one of the scholars that wrote about the area called it voodoo. Said these people down here practicing voodoo, but it wasn't voodoo. He didn't understand anything about shamanism or the practicing of Iroquois people. But again, these things are passed on in our families because that's and even when you talk about the poverty, right? I mean, I talked to my grandfather about that, even though they were landowners, still culturally, I've done interviews about this and talked about this as well. We were raised to be like everybody else. And you didn't act as if you were above anybody else. And my mother and them called it putting on airs. They didn't like for you to put on airs. My grandfather was a landowner, he owned a lot of land. he owned hundreds of acres, but he employed other people in the community. But he looked like everybody in the community, his house and everything else was just like everybody else in the community. And I learned later that my great-grandfather, we're talking about Jake Walton, that story. I mean, he gave the land for the church, and helped build the church. And then he sold pretty much everybody's their land all along the road. I mean, it had to be, over thousands of acres. But you would never have known that because he didn't know. And that was just the way they were. And part of that, I think, is also cultural in the sense that conflicts with whites always center around money and property and land.
Mhm.
And so it was a survival technique to just not tell them who you were or what you had, because it was not going to, they would want it. They would try to take it from you. And they would do what they could to destroy you or destroy it. So that culture is part that's embedded. In North Carolina, again, bringing it back to the Tuscarora aspect of why they blend in with African Americans and others. After the Tuscarora War, not only did a third of the people were they slaughtered in the war, but the state of the colony of North Carolina, shortly after the war, issued a general order that called for the complete extermination of the Tuscarora people in North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, many people who were of Tuscarora ancestry, they just became black. Or if they could, they became white, or they would say they were Cherokee. There were never any Cherokees in North Carolina, at least not in eastern North Carolina. Cherokee were in Tennessee. But a lot of families who have Indian ancestry would say that they're Cherokee.
Right.
And because the Cherokees fought in the war, and they helped the whites to destroy the Tuscaroras and enslave them.
Right.
And so if you said you were Cherokee, the whites saw Cherokees as these great heroes because they helped them to take control of North Carolina. But if you said you were Tuscarora, they would immediately kill the men, take the women and children, and sell them as slaves.
Correct.
So it's just understanding culturally this history and why these families are a certain way. So, and we all change over time, but I'm just saying that's just one of those patterns that was kind of consistent, was that, it's a collective, we all looking out for each other. And I sensed that from here in York, the old families here in York, that there was this collective where the families looked after each
It's all
other.
together. You look out for, you knew your first cousin, your second cousin, your third cousin, you knew who was who, and you associated them. Today, you probably don't even know who the next door neighbor is.
Right, yeah, that's a change.
That's just the way it
You
is.
see, we're doing this like this,
Yeah.
because part of this whole thing, and why we're doing this today,
And speaking to my uncles, I've been seeing, they'll be like, well, and my mom, well, you knew, and you know. No, the kids are outside playing. So Veronita, yes, you're shaking your head, no. Veronita and I were up at the cemetery today with her mama. But, what I was gonna say with my uncles, when I asked about the Atterberries and I asked about the Roscoes, and Uncle Joe was just like, well, yeah, just nonchalant. And I'm like, Uncle Joe, we live in the same town. We've never done anything together as family. We've never done anything together as family. We all grew up together. We were in church together, we were in school together, but we never interacted as family with my generation. And he said, well, we know who we are.
Yeah, I do.
But your children and your grandchildren, we don't know who we are. And that's why we're doing this. And before you say anything here, I just wanted to point out, so over in the corner here, this is Miss Becky Instead. Miss Becky, phenomenal. Anytime we get stuck with research, we call Miss Becky. Because if she doesn't already have the information, she finds the information. She's been a wonderful resource, so thank you for coming out tonight, Ms. Becky, and for all of your work. So she's been gracious enough that all of her files, she probably got files that fit this room from all the years accumulating, she's going to let us get those scanned in. And that is really and truly even more of a footprint of York's Black history, as well as working with Mr. Jeff Kirkland. Jeff is my family on my daddy's side, with those folks that come out of Bamberg. And he has, I see you have your book here, but he has a website, which is yorkblackhistory.com. And he's, for years, been trying to pull these stories out. So we're adding on to that foundation of people like Jeff and like Miss Becky. Their sister, my Aunt Joyce, taught Black history in the city schools. And I think your cousin Serena also, Serena Frost?
Yes, Serena.
Serena. Joyce was the first one that taught Black history in New York, my sister Joyce.
She was the first.
Again, I left York because York is like, to me, Boston and other places up north. They have just as much problem as other places. And I said, I'm leaving, I'm not coming back. And I was gone for almost 40 years. But my oldest brother, he asked me, would I come back to York? And I said, yeah, I'll come back. And so, but I find that the way people are throughout the world is a lot of things are based on capitalism, envy, and all that kind of stuff. And it's very difficult when you're talking and reading and studying that you realize that human beings are all the same, and they don't want to accept that. So they assign different names and titles and things to each other and don't know who they are. Forget that they're human beings. If you study, for instance, you know, I have a minor in sociology, you study health, study all these things, and you know, even in science, that everything is connected. Where you come from, who you are, and all that. Today, for instance, our last president was talking about the Chinese did this to us, that, and the other. So people will start disliking the Asians because they're Chinese. Within this community, most people don't know the difference between a Chinese, a Korean, a Japanese. They're all, you couldn't tell one from another unless you are part of that culture. Then you may know. But in California, they said, well, we can't speak anymore because they think we're Chinese. So it doesn't make any damn difference. You can be from the Philippines, you can be from Korea or Japan. They still think you're Chinese because you're Asian. It's a title. You say, do you know any? Do you really talk to them? Did you live with any? And they say, well, did you? I said, yeah. I've lived with them for a long time. I was sent overseas in many places. And one thing I did is I am an American, I know that. Black American, and I know that. I don't want to hang out with the same guys I work with every day when I'm in a different country. I want to see what the people in that country are doing. I want to get to know them. I want to know them not by what I read in the book or what other people say, but I want to know them as individuals and what they want. What you find out is that everybody is the same. They want to live, get along, and be nice and be part of something, fit in. Look out for their family. That's what people really want to do. Doesn't have, you give them a title, then they want to try to fit in with where they are and who's in charge and who has the power. That's what they want to do, but that's not reality. Then you turn to drugs, you turn to whatever makes you feel better about you. Can be anything. It doesn't have to be, you can call it alcohol, you can call it fentanyl, you can call it anything you want, but it's something to keep you calm. You don't need that. If you have it up here, you can learn. If you talk to individuals as people, men, women, and children, you will find out that everybody basically wants the same as a human being. And you'll have a better world at that. Even though sometimes things will upset you, just think about it, that that person wants to be like you or you want to be like them, but you're still who you are. It's not going to change. And you get one time to go around so far. Nobody's come back to tell us what's on the other side. So you better do what you can while you're here and enjoy the trip and be nice to people if you can. And if you can't be nice to them, leave them alone. Stay away from them. Say, okay, have a nice day. You want something to eat here. Can I live in your house? No, you can't live in my house. I'll give you some food, give you a ride to where you want to go. You're not coming to stay here because you don't know how to act. But I'm going to try to help you. I'm not going to get in your way. And that's the way
We're going to wrap up in about 5 minutes. As far as those last statements and things, for everyone that's here with the books, I just want to hold this up as in on the camera. So Bertie County in Eastern Carolina history. For everyone that's here, Dr. Smallwood has made these books available for all of you. We only ask for a donation. We're not asking you for what that donation looks like, and we do not need it tonight. We will put information out on our site as far as where people can purchase the books going forward, but for everyone here tonight, as a gift from Dr. Smallwood, please do make sure that you get your book, and better yet, that's why I'm cutting things off here in a couple minutes, so that you can get them signed. I want to also thank Cisco. He's been recording tonight. He is with Washington and Winona LLC, I'm sorry, Washington Winona LLC here, their studio's downstairs. And so we're talking about being able to capture these one-on-one conversations or just groups of 2 or 3 people at a time to document our family history. We could bring it into the studio downstairs and capture this information so that we can put together a family storyboard with this. So he was able to get some of the video at the cemetery today. He's been recording for us tonight, and he's been physically helping at the cemetery for about a year now in helping to take care of our family. So thank you. So in these last couple minutes as wrapping up, Jeff, did you have anything as far as maybe just a brief snapshot of your Black history and what you captured in your book?
Yeah, I don't know if Jim got a chance to give you a copy of the book that I had from Christmas Addicts.
Yes.
He did?
Yes, yeah, I have it, yeah.
No, I'm just having Joe here in New York. Our connection was the Bamberg connection. I heard you guys mention that a little earlier.
Yeah.
My grandfather came here in 1921
Okay.
from Bamberg with a group of, I don't know, close to 200 black men came up at that time, working on the farm, and working in the factories and paved the roads and all like that. And really changed the tone and the tenor here in York, Pennsylvania at that time. I always like to point out this one article. There was a guy, William Myers. William Myers was the first bell captain at the Yorktown Hotel when it was built. He was a magnificent bell captain. Everybody raved about him. But he said in a newspaper article back at that time that when the Bambergers came to York, York changed. And he said before the Bambergers came, white folks would let blacks go into the restaurants or into the movie houses. But when the Bambergers came, all that changed. I didn't hear it was supposed by how it changed and all like that, other than they weren't welcome, like that. But I remember as a young person, they used to call us Bambergers, which was intended to tell us that we were countrified or something. But we take that as a badge of honor now, pride, because of the magnificent history, of the folks that came up here from Bamberg. And when Sam was telling me about Bertie County, I was definitely interested in that connection too, because like Rebecca knows, it's all connected, interconnected and all. We're trying to pull that picture together. We have a glorious history, and I heard you talking earlier about the connections, our family, remembering the traditions, how the mothers and matriarchs pass things down. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the issues in our community now, that our young folks are not connected to that magnificent, glorious history and achievements of our folks and all, and so they get lost out here in the mix. So if we could do what all we're doing to bring that back, Sankofa look back and bring back that tradition and that history, I think it just does well for our community.
I agree.
So I appreciate what you're doing, Doc, and just was interested in hearing what you had to say. And I bought a copy of another book that I had down. I want to share it with you.
Thank you.
That's just a pictorial book of some of the photos that I've gathered around here and all. And hope you enjoy that. And my cards are in there also, the way people can correspond when the need arises.
Yes, I'll contact you just as soon as I get back.
Okay.
Yeah, and you definitely will hear from me right away.
Okay.
And again, I appreciate this. This is excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.